keynote speaker is the author of Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. He's the managing director of the Libertarian Institute, and he's the host of Anti-War Radio on Pacifica 90.7 FM in Los Angeles. Please welcome to the stage Mr. Scott Horton, ladies and gentlemen.
All right. What's the difference between Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump?
Nothing.
Right, exactly. The Waco massacre also would have been an acceptable answer. That went over all right. Okay. Listen, I'm following a lot of really great speakers today, a lot of really energetic speakers with a lot of really great stuff to say about freedom and policy and all kinds of things. And I'm sorry because I'm probably, is that better? See, you were lying. You said you could hear me. I see. All right. So, I mean, I'm probably going to ruin the mood a little bit here, but I'll try to start off with something a little bit light. We have any Ron Paul fans here? Ron Paul, guys. Okay, good. Now, I wonder, did anybody here find Ron Paul and therefore then libertarianism because of the Rudy Giuliani moment in 2007? Yeah, a few? Okay. But you all remember the Rudy Giuliani moment in 2007? Right. So, Ron was, a member of the House of Representatives, 1 out of 435. He had one fan in every neighborhood in America, but just one. And he wasn't a famous person. He was a little old country doctor, Republican member of Congress that most people had really never heard of. And yet that made him a global star and a major force in American politics for a while there. And what it was, remember what he was arguing about? He was saying that America picked the fight with the terrorists, that we were bombing them long before they ever attacked us. Get it straight. Which you would not have predicted that what Ron needs to do is go up there and tell them that, and that's what'll make his campaign. But it did, and the reason why was because people could tell that this old man respects me enough to tell me the truth. He's not up there strutting and posturing and being Rudy Giuliani, trying to bully everyone else and prove what an alpha dog he is. He's just trying to tell us the honest truth. And you know what? Now that I think about it, actually the 1990s did exist. And there were some things that happened then, back before September 11th. And it really rang true to a lot of people, and it really brought a lot of people into our movement because that was something that Ron Paul, who is really our greatest spokesman, has always prioritized, is peace. And he sets really a great example. If you watch his show, The Liberty Report with Dan McAdams, 5 days a week, they cover foreign policy, foreign policy, foreign policy. It's almost all that matters to the guy because of how important he is. And he knows everything about it. He doesn't just talk about libertarian principle and anti-imperialism and how important these things are to each other, but he knows everything about the situation in Syria or Korea, for example. And I'll actually tell you a story. The first time I ever saw Ron Paul, my moment was 10 years before. It was 1997 when he first went back to Congress, and I saw him on C-SPAN in the middle of the night on the reruns, and he's speaking to an empty House chamber. And he's saying, my God, the British papers today published these documents, I have them here, that show that President George Bush was selling chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein. And even during Operation Iraqi Shield, in the buildup to the actual Iraq War I. What is going on here? And I thought, oh my God, I can't believe a congressman is talking about that on TV. And then I looked at the bottom of the screen and it said Ron Paul, R, Texas, where George Bush Sr. nominally is from, made his fortune there, etc. Certainly he's a major part of the Republican Party in Texas in that era. And how could this guy be so brave to say such a thing? And yet, of course, that was his deal. What you see is what you get with Ron Paul. And again, I think that he sets a really great example for the rest of us, and one that I've really tried to follow. All right, so blowback. Ron Paul said in his response to Giuliani trying to bully him, he said, I'm sorry, the CIA coined the term. Blowback is when you have consequences of long-term consequences of secret foreign policies, so that when the consequences come, the people are taken by surprise and therefore are left open and susceptible to false interpretations about what has caused the violence. And as he said, if we ignore that at our own peril, and we end up putting ourselves in greater danger. if we think that we can get away with intervening and then explain away the violence that we get in return as being motivated by something other than the violence that we had begun in the first place. And so the primary example of this, in fact, the CIA coined the term after they overthrew the government of Iran, the democratically elected government of Iran, in 1953. And in the after action report, one of the CIA officers wrote, "We're going to have some blowback coming down the line from this." And it was 25 years later, 26 years later, when the revolution broke out in Iran, and the American people just heard "Death to America" and saw riots and burning flags and thought, what a bunch of insane, crazy people who hate us, had forgotten that they'd been our allies for the last 25 years, and blamed Islam and blamed everybody but themselves for creating the situation. In fact, it's an interesting side note that when the revolution broke out in 1979, the Shah Reza Pahlavi, the dictator there, he was already dying of cancer, and his regime was falling apart. He was basically toast anyway. And the CIA and the State Department advised Jimmy Carter's government, well, don't worry about Ayatollah Khamenei, because we know him. He helped us overthrow Mossadegh back in 1953. He's an okay guy, and we can deal with him. In fact, it wasn't until David Rockefeller convinced Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski to invite the Shah into the United States for medical treatment. And that caused the riots and the seizing of the hostages at the embassy and the major crisis. Everybody remembers this like it all happened on one day. But in fact, the Americans were okay with the revolution at first. It was an old friend of theirs from dirty tricks in the past. And then, of course, that's a good place to start our story. Oh, I was supposed to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you, and then I'll tell you what I told you. So what I'm going to tell you is, this is all America's fault, our politicians' fault for getting us into this mess. Then I'm going to tell you that we didn't need to have really an Afghan war at all, even after the terrorists attacked us. And then I'm going to explain why the war can't be won and we have to just leave. And then I'll tie it back up with, again, explaining, as I'm about to, why the Americans have done everything that their al-Qaeda enemies have wanted them to do. All right, so 1979, the Shah's overthrown. There's the revolution in Iran, and Jimmy Carter gives the green light to Saddam Hussein to invade Iran. That starts the Iran-Iraq War that lasted for 8 years. At the same time, or soon thereafter, in fact, Jimmy Carter signed a finding in July of '79 authorizing the CIA to start backing the Mujahideen holy warriors fighting against the communists, the communist sock puppet government of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And their goal, as they said at the time, was to try to provoke the Soviet Union into invading. And in fact, the Soviet Union did invade in Christmas 1979. Now, it's actually not clear that the Americans truly had provoked them into invading, because in fact their own sock puppet dictator was too communist, and he was turning the country upside down and causing a civil war. And the first thing the Soviets did when they got there was kill him and replace him. So it's not really necessarily the case that the Americans lured the Soviets in, but they bragged that they had, and they bragged that that was their intent all along. And they backed the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union there in what was called Operation Cyclone, the biggest CIA operation up until that time, for really through the decade, through the rest of the 1980s, until the Soviets finally withdrew in 1989 as the Soviet Union was falling apart. And it had, in fact, fallen apart partly because they had overextended themselves into Afghanistan and had been driven into bankruptcy. And if you ask the Reaganites, they'll tell you this is how Ronald Reagan heroically defeated the Soviet Union. He did a massive arms buildup, which they tried to match and couldn't afford, and he lured them and bogged them down, giving them their own Vietnam in Afghanistan, which finally was the straw that broke the camel's back and destroyed world communism once and for all. This was, to hear the Americans tell it, their success, but of course to the Mujahideen it was theirs. And the Mujahideen at the time included the Afghan so-called holy warriors themselves, mostly Pashtun tribesmen fighting, but also other tribes. But also it included Arabs who had been transported by Saudi Arabia and by the CIA, working with the Pakistanis, from across the Muslim world to go and fight in Afghanistan. They were called the Arab Afghans. And In 1986, a friend of mine, a great war reporter named Eric Margulies, who covered the Afghan war in the 1980s and really supported the CIA's efforts there and the Mujahideen's efforts there against the communists. He was interviewing a guy named Abdul Azam, and he was really the first Osama bin Laden, who really was the lead organizer of bringing these Arabs to Pakistan and Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. And Azam told Eric Margulies, as soon as we're done with the Soviet Union, we're coming for you American imperialists next. And Margulies thought this was crazy. He was an Ike Eisenhower Republican, an Army veteran, a fierce anti-communist. And here, the Americans, as he said to Azam, the Americans, we're here helping the Saudis and the Pakistanis help you to fight against the Soviet Union. How can you call us an empire? And Azam said, because look, you have troops occupying Saudi Arabia, and of course you support the regime in Israel. And so Eric Margulies realized that there's actually something to this and that we have to be careful of these guys. We help build up this army, and they already are looking at us before the Soviets are even done, and quite confident they're going to win, which they did. And he was right about the bases in Saudi Arabia, because as part of the reaction against the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter had announced, which Jimmy Carter had been trying to provoke, Jimmy Carter announced the Carter Doctrine that basically increased the alliance with Saudi Arabia and declared the Persian Gulf an American lake and said, we are the dominant force here and we will not tolerate anyone else trying to be the dominant force or threatening our interests, or we will treat it as an attack on the United States itself. And they started building bases in Oman and in Bahrain, Qatar, and especially in Saudi Arabia. And this was already provoking the reaction in Saudi back in the 1980s among the people there. So then Iraq War I breaks out. I'll try to make this long story short, but Saddam couldn't pay back all the money that he'd borrowed to fight the Iran-Iraq War, to contain the Iranian Revolution. And the Kuwaitis were overproducing from shared oil wells under the border region there. And they're calling in all their loans, and they're refusing to negotiate. And he asked permission, more or less, and I think that's fair to say. If you can check it all out because of Chelsea Manning, you can finally read the State Department cables about it yourself, where April Glaspie on July 25th, 1990, met with Saddam Hussein and made it clear that, you know what, we really don't mind too much if you invade at least the north of Iraq. And April Glaspie herself later told the New York Times, well, we didn't think he was going to take the whole country. And so they had really told Saddam Hussein to go ahead and break the Kuwaitis' knees for overproducing to punish them basically for overproducing from those shared oil wells. But then Hussein went too far. And at that point, it was in various people's interests, including especially the Pentagon, to use it as an excuse to expand America's footprint in the Middle East. And so instead of really ever trying to negotiate an Iraqi exit from Kuwait, they built up this Operation Desert Shield that I mentioned before and launched Iraq War I, which they said was quick and easy, no big problem, except at the end of the war, George Bush Sr., over Voice of America radio, and had the Air Force drop leaflets all over southern and northern Iraq, where it's predominantly Shiite areas and predominantly Kurds, that urged the people to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. And they took this in large numbers, and their leadership took this to mean that America would back them up. And yet, they didn't. And what happened was, as soon as Shiite militias started coming across the border from Iran, the Bush government panicked and realized they were reversing Ronald Reagan's policy of supporting Saddam to contain the Iranian Shiite revolution, and they were in fact now importing it. And so they balked, and they let Saddam Hussein keep his attack helicopters and some of his tanks, and he used them to crush the Shiite and the Kurdish rebellion and killed over 100,000 people. The great stab in the back, the Bay of Pigs of the desert of 1991. But then this became the excuse to stay. They had built up their bases far beyond before in Saudi Arabia in order to wage the first Iraq war. But now they had to stay to enforce what they called the no-fly zones to prevent Saddam Hussein from attacking the Shia in the south and the Kurds in the north, and basically for all time. And they guaranteed really full autonomy for the Kurdish north of the country and protected it with these no-fly zones. And so Cheney actually, after September 11th, in I guess accidental, candid moment, told Tim Russert, it was on September 16th, his first appearance on Meet the Press after September 11th. He said, you know, bin Laden's goal, obviously, was to drive us out of that part of the world. Not they hate our freedom, they hate American dominance in the Middle East. That was what Dick Cheney said himself, admitted that that was the motive. And he's right, absolutely, about the motive there, but then he's wrong on their strategy. If he, and I think probably deliberately so. But the strategy of September 11th was not to scare us away, but to bait us into making the same mistake that the Soviet Union had, invading Afghanistan, bogging down, bleeding us to bankruptcy, to ruin our empire, and then ultimately force it out of the Middle East entirely. And that only then could they have their revolutions. So there are 6 major reasons that bin Laden and his group cited in declaring their war on the United States and their acolytes too, starting with their attacks against Rabbi Haqqani in 1990 in New York City, and then with the first World Trade Center bombing attack and the plot against the Lincoln Tunnels and the other New York landmarks, the United Nations building. And there are various successful and unsuccessful attacks throughout the 1990s in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Africa, the embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya. And then, of course, there was the USS Cole. And all along, they were trying to bait the Americans into taking advantage. Now, in the 1990s, the Joint Staff in the Pentagon, the policy planners in the Pentagon had a saying, it was like their apocryphal kind of cliche figure speech, that terrorism is a small price to pay for being an empire. And you can kind of see what they meant, not in a moral sense, but in a literal descriptive sense. A truck bomb here and a truck bomb there doesn't really amount to much. 6 people only had died in the first World Trade Center attack, and never mind your imagination when you use it and realize that if that attack had been successful at midday and had succeeded in toppling one tower into the other, we could have had 50,000 killed in an instant there. On 9/11, the tower stood for an extra hour and a half or so and gave people time to get out. But you look at what could have been with that first World Trade Center attack, it's an absolute nightmare. But to them, it's a small price to pay. The USS Cole, yeah, it got bombed and some sailors died, but it didn't sink. And at Khobar Tower, some American airmen died, but American politics didn't care. They didn't pay a price for it in any way, politically speaking. And so I think it was, mostly outside of their imagination that we were going to have an attack in the U.S. that was going to cost so many lives. They could go ahead and continue, and either way, they could use it as an excuse to double down. Now, so the 6 reasons that Al-Qaeda cited in their attacks against the United States were American bases in Saudi Arabia that were used to enforce the blockade and the no-fly zone bombing no-fly zone patrols over Iraq. American support for Israel in their occupations of Palestine and at that time southern Lebanon, as well as American support for every dictator in the region, which is true. Every king from Algeria through to the military dictatorship in Pakistan at the time. They have an elected government now, but every one of these governments, less Iran and Syria, were the sock puppets of the United States on the Hosni Mubarak model, the King Fahd model, and that America supported these dictators in order to pressure them to keep oil prices artificially low, in order to subsidize America's economy at the expense of the people in the Middle East. And then on top of that, he said that the Americans turn a blind eye and don't say a word when Russia, China, India, and Uzbekistan persecute Muslims. When they kill Muslims, the Americans who claim to care all about human rights don't have a word to say. And it's interesting, actually, that that's not really true. In fact, Bill Clinton backed the jihadists in Bosnia in the early 1990s, early to mid-1990s. He backed the jihadists in Chechnya to a limited degree, but to a degree. His government helped back the rise of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan, as well as helped train Uyghur fighters for use against China. So maybe he didn't speak out about humanitarian abuses, but he outright took their side. And then especially in 1999 in the Kosovo War. And believe it or not, but it's in the book. It's on sale now. It's Fool's Errand. I got some in the back. Don't make me get on the plane with them, guys. that literally Bill Clinton and two other Democratic congressmen, not two other, but two Democratic congressmen, all said something to the effect of, can you believe these ungrateful Muslim fanatic terrorists, that they would attack us after all that we've done for them? In Bosnia and in Kosovo especially, can you believe it? But of course, the other 6 reasons that bin Laden always cited, those were all still there. The occupation of Saudi and support for Israel and the bombing of Iraq from Saudi, of course, at the top of the list. And that was what they always said. But then on September 11th, a lot of you guys remember this, and I'm sorry I'm going so into detail here, but I was told earlier from a guy that he was 10 years old in 4th grade at the time, and he could really use a lesson in this. A lot of time has passed. A lot of people don't remember. A lot of people never learned in the first place. And, you know, so anyway, I hope you get it. But at the time, and if you remember back at the time, the footage, especially the second plane, because they didn't have the footage of the first plane at first, but the footage of the second plane hitting the tower, the plane literally comes out of the clear blue sky, just like in the cliche, right? So if you didn't know anything about it, like what an impressive symbol here that, well, I don't know what's going on, but something horrible has happened, so tell me who to hate. Because we were all pretty mad, right? So, but that's blowback, right? It's not just consequences. It's consequences, long-term consequences of secret foreign policies. So that when the results come back, the American people don't understand what's happening, and then they're susceptible to false impressions like they hate us because we're good. And that's how evil is. And Muslims and Islam itself makes people hate goodness. And the more innocent you are, the more of a target you are. And so there's only one thing left to do against an implacable enemy like that, and an irrational enemy like that, is to just kill him. There's no point in trying to understand. There's no point in going back and saying, well, what did Osama bin Laden actually say was his problem? And do we really need these bases in Saudi Arabia anyway? And interestingly, Paul Wolfowitz, who is really, other than Cheney and Bush themselves, the single most important and influential figure in getting us into the second Iraq War, said that part of the reason he wanted to invade Iraq was so we could get our troops out of Saudi Arabia, where they were doing so much to motivate Osama bin Laden and the people that joined his group. And so his solution was, we'll just move them a few hundred miles north into Iraq, and that'll be great. So you don't have to believe the second part of it, but he sure was right about the problem. And the Saudis were stressing, you've got to get these bases out of here. And that was the reason why, is all the good that it was doing for the enemy and keeping them there. And so now I will quote myself. No, I'm just kidding. I am going to read the book, but I'm going to quote from Osama bin Laden's son, and some of his sons, I guess 1 or 2 of them at least, are terrorists, but this one is not. And this one met in a nightclub in Damascus, Syria, with a Rolling Stone reporter in 2010. So this is when Osama bin Laden was still alive and at large. So forgive that part of it, but I think you'll like the context here, understand. My father's dream, Omar said, was to bring the Americans to Afghanistan. He would do the same thing he did to the Russians. I was surprised the Americans took the bait. I so much respected the mentality of President Clinton. He was the one who was smart. When my father attacked his places, he sent a few cruise missiles to my father's training camp. He didn't get my father, but after all the war in Afghanistan, they still don't have my father. They have spent hundreds of billions. Better for America to keep the money for its economy. In Clinton's time, America was very, very smart, not like a bull that runs after the red scarf. I was in Afghanistan when Bush was elected. My father was so happy. This is the kind of president he needs, one who will attack and spend money and break the country. I'm sure my father wanted McCain to win more than Obama in 2008. McCain has the same mentality as Bush. Now, of course, these are naive takes on Clinton and Obama, but we certainly understand what he means and the real lesson there about George W. Bush, that when Osama bin Laden saw this pretend tough guy, faux, macho, hide behind everybody else's actual tough guy son become the president, that he wasn't afraid. He didn't say, oh no, now what is America going to do? He was licking his chops and saying, this guy's a perfect mark to get him to do what I want him to do, which is to put the foot on the accelerator, not to pull the empire back, but to go overboard in order to destroy America the long way and the hard way. and force us out then. All right, so moving on. After September 11th happened, we really did not have to have a war in Afghanistan at all. In fact, the Taliban did offer to negotiate. Now, at first they talked a little bit tough. They were trying to save some face. And they said, listen, if you provide evidence that Osama bin Laden is guilty, then we will turn Osama bin Laden over and his men over to any Muslim country. Which actually is pretty reasonable, especially considering there's plenty of evidence that Al-Qaeda was behind the attack, and certainly the government knew in an instant who was behind it. They knew it was coming just as well as a lot of people did. So that would have been easy enough to prove. And any Muslim country includes Jordan or Egypt or Malaysia or any sock puppet country that's owned lock, stock, and barrel by America, and this would have just been the slightest face saving. They would have extradited bin Laden and all of his men to a courtroom in Virginia or New York in an instant, in a day, without the slightest resistance. But Bush said, no, I already said no negotiations. We're not negotiating. You hand them over. That's your ultimatum, or else that's it. So then they said, well, how about we give them to the Pakistanis? And provided some evidence. Give us some evidence. In fact, the Taliban hadn't been in on the plot at all. They only found out that an attack was coming, and they didn't know the details, from an Uzbek jihadist who had heard it. That was how they heard it, through the grapevine, and they had tried to warn the United States that an Al-Qaeda attack was impending. The Taliban regime had not even finished conquering the entire country yet and winning their civil war. And here Al-Qaeda was trying to get them in trouble with the world's superpower. And, you know, a radical is a conservative the day he seizes the capital city. And the Taliban had gotten that far, you know. And they didn't want to give it up. And in the summer before the attack, Mullah Omar himself had done an interview with Arnaud de Bourgrave from UPI, the Washington Times, who had covered the Afghan war in the 80s. And he said, Osama bin Laden is like a chicken bone stuck in my throat. I can neither swallow him nor spit him out. And he went on, and he's clearly seething that bin Laden doesn't even have religious authority. He hasn't done 12 years of religious schooling to issue a fatwa, and he sure as hell doesn't speak for my government here. And he's stuck between a rock and a hard place with the Al-Qaeda guys, who are all Egyptians and Saudis and so forth, not Taliban, not Afghans at all. And so they actually really wanted to get rid of this guy, and the Americans had been negotiating to have him handed over. And in fact, they would say things like, oh, Osama bin Laden, actually, you know, we can't find him right now. He may have gone out falconing or something and gotten lost, but we don't know where he is, which is a nice way of saying he's outside of our protection right now. Go ahead and kill him. But the Americans wouldn't do it. In fact, Michael Scheuer, the CIA officer, said he gave Bill Clinton 10 chances to kill bin Laden that he refused to take. In fact, I'll go ahead and throw in this anecdote, even though it's bad for time. I read a report where Bill Clinton actually gave us a talk in Australia on September 10th, where he said that his biggest regret was that he didn't kill bin Laden. But then you know what his excuse was? That I would have had to carpet bomb a little town called Kandahar, and it would have killed thousands of innocent people, and so I couldn't do it. But that's just an outright lie, because of course, first of all, Kandahar is a major city of tens of thousands of people, maybe more than 100,000 people there. And bin Laden lived at what was called the Tarnak farm that was way off in the outskirts of town. We're talking about 1 or 2 bombs and maybe a family or 2 worth of collateral damage. Not that killing kids is okay, but don't give me this stuff about you would have had to obliterate the entire town of Kandahar in order to get one man. Well, what a bogus excuse for him to try to hide behind. And then I don't know how the Australia time difference works, where he wakes up and sees the towers falling down. But anyway, the Taliban really wanted to get rid of Osama bin Laden, and after the bombs started falling at the beginning of October, they said, fine, we'll turn bin Laden and his men over to any third country. Any third country, and they probably didn't mean Israel. That was a laugh line. I'm glad you like the second one. It was that could have been Mexico or Canada or Britain, right, or France. That was the slightest bit of face saving for the Taliban, who are bound by their tribal Pashtun Wali code to never give over a guest to a foreign attacker. And yet here they are doing so, and George Bush says too little, too late, and goes ahead and he starts the war. All right, now, you might say, that's fine, Scott Horton, but honestly, I don't care if the Taliban wanted to negotiate. I didn't want bin Laden in jail. I wanted him bombed to death. I wanted, and all of the Al-Qaeda guys too. And I would say, you know what, for the sake of argument, I don't really think that's right because of collateral damage and so forth. But if you're going to argue that, then I can say still, you didn't have to have a war against the Taliban. They could have fought a war only against Al-Qaeda, which again was quite a separate group, in which the Bush administration knew and recognized full well. But what did they do? They spent 6 weeks, 8 weeks, really 8 weeks, screwing around fighting the Taliban in the north of the country. They sided with this warlord, General Dostum, and they went to fight all his enemies, none of whom were Al-Qaeda or had anything to do with the attack on the United States. They went and wasted time taking Mazar-e-Sharif and all these other towns and actually participating in a massacre of thousands of Taliban prisoners by General Dostum's men that our Green Berets oversaw, when they had no business even being up there at all, when the enemy was getting away in far eastern Afghanistan in the Nangarhar province. All right, so, but then finally the CIA Special Activities Division, which is their paramilitary forces, and the Army Delta Force, which is their top tier special operations forces. They cornered Al-Qaeda and bin Laden and his men, probably about 1,000 people, including all the fellow travelers who'd come with them, at a place called Tora Bora in the White Mountains of Nangarhar province in eastern Afghanistan. And they had them cornered down to 1 square mile. Now, I'll admit to you, and it is an admission, you'll see why in a minute, that they really did call in a lot of air power. And they used B-52s and they used F-16s. They dropped a lot of bombs on these guys, and they killed at least 500 something of them. And in fact, they even used a 15,000-pound conventional bomb called the Daisy Cutter in order to try to get them. And yet at the same time, they refused to authorize Marines, Rangers, or Green Berets, all of whom were available, to come in as reinforcements and help these few CIA and Delta Force operators there who were relying on these local warlord tribesmen to help them, who clearly were not up to the task and didn't want to help. And our current Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, had 4,000 Marines available just miles away, and he was denied permission to go and back them up and help to seal the Pakistani border. Again, Green Berets fighting the Taliban in the north, and the Bagram Air Base on the Shamali Plain just north of Kabul had already been seized by the Army Rangers. There were at least 5,000 of them there already. And the CIA and the Delta Force begged, that's their words, begged for weeks to have these men come and help them seal the escape route into Pakistan. And they were refused over and over again. In fact, Henry Crumpton, who ran the operation for the CIA back at Langley, brought a map to the White House, and he laid it down, I don't know if it was on the floor or on a desk, I think on the floor, and explained to Bush and Cheney, this is where we are, this is what we're doing, this is the warlords we're stuck with who are trying to bribe but aren't really helping, and this is what we'd like to do. And he was again denied permission. And I make the case further in the book, and it is just it is just speculation. It's hard to seriously, to really know for sure, but I think it's a fair case that they deliberately decided to let Osama bin Laden escape, that they preferred him on the loose because it was better to have him as a symbol of Al-Qaeda, as this permanent terrorist enemy out there. And it was very important to them that they could try to frame Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, for being in league with Osama bin Laden. And yet, what would that matter if bin Laden was already dead? And if the American people already believed that the war on terrorism was over, that we'd won? Our enemy was only 400 men, and we'd crushed them, and so now we can move on with our lives. They wanted to keep it going. And they made this very clear, and it's very clear in the book, that this was pursuing larger agendas was their agenda, and I believe letting bin Laden go was certainly part of that. And you know, it's interesting, I'm sure you're all familiar, if you've ever heard a word about bin Laden and Al-Qaeda's escape from Tora Bora, it's that they slipped across the border into Pakistan. Like they had just jumped into hyperspace, or you know, like it was the state line where the sheriff is not allowed to cross, and so the bank robbers get away, and he's got to stomp on his hat and cuss. And yet, but this is the Delta Force in the CIA, and Pakistan is an ally of ours. And our Deputy Secretary of State had already told them, we'll bomb you into the Stone Age if you don't cooperate with our war in Afghanistan right now. And they had already said, sure thing. And Robert Grenier, the CIA station chief in Islamabad, says he had already worked out a deal with the Pakistani army and their frontier corps to make sure to protect against friendly fire casualties if the Americans came across the border chasing the Al-Qaeda guys. But they were forbidden permission to follow them across. And in fact, there was one Delta Force officer who wrote a book about this and did a 60-minute special about this, where he said, again, they begged permission to just go and chase these guys, and they were willing to risk their lives to do so, and they were forbidden. There was a group of about 130 that got across that were captured by the Pakistani army, or Frontier Corps, I guess, and then there was a group of about 80 men that had escaped with Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and made it off into the tribal areas of Pakistan. That were let go and absolutely didn't have to be. And the Delta Force guy elaborated. They had all these plans to mine all the valleys to at least slow them down so they could catch up with them. And they had plans, and they got air power, right? So they were going to get lifted into Pakistan and then come over the mountains and attack them from the east. And they had all these things, and they're just begging Bush and Cheney. They're chomping at the bit. Let us go after these guys. This is Osama bin Laden 2 months after September 11th. Why aren't we doing this? Cried the guys who were trying to do it. And anyway, so I'm belaboring that point a bit too much, but I saw a couple skeptical glances. I want to convince you at least that you can see more of that case in the book, and that'd be worth taking a look at anyway. All right, now, even if you're saying, okay, Scott, but you know what, the Taliban let bin Laden live in Afghanistan for 6 years or something, so I want them bombed too. I'm so mad about September 11th, you know, go ahead and bomb them. All right, fine, so bomb the Taliban if that's your point of view, but then we didn't have to create a new government to take over the country, and one that at the time we intervened, this Northern Alliance only controlled like 1/10 of the land and had support of less of the people even than that. When the Taliban had marched into the capital city, where virtually, and they're all Pashtuns and religious, you know, right-wing, fundamentalist zealots, when they marched into the multi-ethnic Kabul, they were welcomed as long as they would instill law and order and kick Massoud and these horrible criminal warlords out. That was how they'd won the civil war, was the people preferred them to the men that they were replacing. And so the Americans then basically switched sides in Ronald Reagan's Afghan war and took the side of those who had been favored by the Russians and put them in power in Kabul. And then not only that, if you're saying, yeah, but Scott, they had to create democracy, fine, they still should have left. Because instead what they did was then go to war against all of the new government's enemies. A war that we're still fighting 16 years later. All right, so, I'm not even at the maps yet, I better hurry. Right after the war, the Taliban did not say this will be the mother of all battles and we will fight you in the streets and the fields and the hills and all this. They said, we surrender, we give up, we don't want to fight. You guys obviously have already, you know, obliterated our infantry. We're done. They withdrew from Kabul and they withdrew from Kandahar city in the south, and they made peace with the occupation. And in fact, the first sock puppet leader that America put in power there, Hamid Karzai, was a Pashtun and the son of a prominent tribal leader from Kandahar province, and they recognized his government as Islamic and legitimate, and they did not contest it. And they just basically quit the field and retired, which was unfortunate for a bunch of young Marines and young Army Rangers who were looking for a fight to pick, that they didn't really have any fights. And so they had to pick some. And what ended up happening, well, I'll give you a couple examples. You may have heard of the movie or seen the movie Restrepo, or its sequel, Korengal, the documentaries about these guys, Army, I think some Rangers, but mostly regular Army, fighting in the Korengal Valley. Well, these people didn't even know what the New World was. They thought when they first saw the Americans that they were Soviets, because they didn't know the Soviets had left and they didn't know that we had come. They lived in their own little nation. They weren't even really part of Afghanistan. They even have their own little dialect and everything. It's this little valley not too little, valley of people minding their own damn business. Well, how did America end up having this massive fight in Korengal Valley? We're 2 documentaries over, and 40 American dead and hundreds wounded and thousands of Afghans. It all started because some warlord who was in the timber industry, so a lot of logging there, had some business competition. And so he told the Americans, those guys are Taliban and Al-Qaeda terrorists, kill them, and the Americans did. And that was what started the war. It was just simple corruption and ignorance, the information problem to the nth degree. And they ended up fighting a war in the Korengal Valley for years, and for nothing. And then in 2008, they said, okay, let's go, and then they turned around and left. And all they'd done was kill thousands of people, bring new enemies to the Korengal Valley who were, basically aliens, Afghan aliens to that valley, bringing violence with them, and achieved nothing for it. Another example is Haqqani, who you may be familiar with, the Haqqani network, which is the second most powerful insurgent group against the Americans after the Afghan Taliban in this war. And they've killed hundreds of Americans at least, and certainly thousands of Afghans. Well, it never had to happen at all. Haqqani was one of the CIA's guys from the 1980s. And he was one of the warlords that the Taliban had pushed out. But after the war, he said, hey, I don't want to fight. Let's all be friends. He tried to go to Hamid Karzai's inaugural swearing-in ceremony, and the U.S. bombed him because they were listening to the advice of another warlord named PKZ, Pachakan Zadari. And PKZ hated Haqqani and wanted Haqqani's fiefdom for himself, and so he told the Americans, this guy's with Osama bin Laden, he's a terrorist, he's a killer, and the Americans bombed him. And then not only that, they bombed his home village and his house, and they ended up bombing a school for poor children that killed 43 children that he had built. And at this point, Haqqani left and went to Pakistan and stayed there for a couple of years, but then he sent his brother to try to make peace again, and the CIA accepted him. And the CIA created a counterterrorism pursuit team and hired him and put him to work. But then the military betrayed him, and they put him in the Bagram prison and tortured him. And only then, in 2005, did Jalaluddin Haqqani, it's now his son who runs it, only then did he become an enemy of the United States. An absolutely self-inflicted wound within the as a microcosm of this larger self-inflicted wound that America is doing to these people and to itself here. All right? And so in doing so, they've really picked a fight that they cannot win. And so here's where we get to the map. If you see the light blue there in the east and in the south it's very sparsely populated, but that's still all Pashtun land there. And I guess some Baluchs, but mostly this is all Pashtuns in here. So the Pashtuns, they aren't the majority, but they're the plurality of the country. They're a solid 40%, and they used to be estimated at as much as 60%. But they're a solid plurality of the country. Bear with me here. You don't have to memorize the names of all the tribes, but you'll be able to pick this up here. So in the north, what we see in the orange and the green and the yellow here, these are the Hazaras, the Tajiks, and the Uzbeks. And they represent much smaller minority groups, like 15% and less. And ultimately what America is doing is trying to foist a coalition government of these small minority groups onto the plurality population of the country. As bad as Iraq War II was, there was ultimately a finish at some point when America was fighting a war for the super majority Shiite Arabs, 60% in Iraq War II. At some point they won with our help. All right, 2008. Here, this is a fool's errand. This cannot be won, because not only are we trying to foist this group of minority groups, this coalition of minority groups on the plurality in the South, these are people who will never give in. These are people whose entire culture is defined as defenders of invasion, from invasion. They've been invaded countless times, from Alexander and the Golden Horde, the British repeatedly, the Soviet Union, and I'm leaving out a lot of them. In between, they're between India and everywhere. And so their very essence of what it means to be a person is to resist foreign intervention. And they will not give it up. Now, the truth is that there are some Pashtuns in the government. I don't want to say there's no Pashtuns in the government, but when we put Pashtuns in the government, that doesn't mean that these people now have representation. It just means that now they have even worse warlords closer to home. They'd be better off in a state of anarchy, but now we've got a governor for you. But instead, it's someone who's just going to come and make their lives much, much worse. And a very important case, I'll mention this guy, Shirzai, who was previously, he was the governor of Kandahar and then later of Nangarhar province. And this guy's a child rapist and a heroin dealer and a torturer and a murderer. In every way, the worst kind of criminal. And the American-backed regime there, he was the best friend of Hamid Karzai. And he was a governor twice. And that's just one of them. General Dostum, who's currently the vice president, he worked for the Soviets. He was a communist in the 1980s. As I said, he was the guy that did that massacre near Mazar-e Sharif in the fall of 2001. And he had to flee to Turkey recently because he had his men hold down a parliamentarian who was getting out of line and rape him with the barrel of an AK-47. And so, but instead of being prosecuted, he just had to go leave and live in Turkey for 6 months or something, and now he's back again. This is the former defense minister, now the vice president, for years now, the vice president of Afghanistan. Although that wasn't making my point about the Pashtuns, but just overall about these warlords and the men we're putting in power there. All right, so another thing you can't see here, but just use your imagination. To the east is Pakistan, and guess what? They're all light blue. They're the Pashtuns too, at least a big part of them right along the border. In fact, the eastern border of Afghanistan is known as the Durand Line because a British imperialist named Durand drew it back in, I think, the 1880s in order to try to divide and conquer the Pashtun tribes in the first place. That's why that border is that border. But of course, that's only so effective. It's somewhat effective, I guess. But it means that the Pashtun resistance, aka what's known as the Taliban in Afghanistan, has safe haven on the other side of the border, as the Viet Cong guerrillas in Vietnam had safe haven in Laos and Cambodia. Except in Laos and Cambodia, the governments there, who are both friendly to the United States, didn't have any ability to do anything about it. But in this case, the Pakistani government does have an ability to do something about it, so you might wonder why they don't. In fact, there's a brand new book out that says not only do they tolerate this, but that Directorate S at Pakistani Intelligence, ISI, have been very deliberately, and we've really known this, have been backing the Afghan Taliban since 2005 in Afghanistan. But like we already talked about, the Pakistanis are our allies. So why would they be doing this? And the answer is because this coalition that we're putting in power of the Hazaras, Tajiks, and Uzbeks is favored by the Indians. And the Indians are the Pakistanis' bitter rivals to the east as they quarrel over the disputed region of Kashmir. They've had 4 wars since independence and the division of Pakistan from India by Britain when they withdrew in 1949. And they both now are armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons and threaten each other all the time. And the Pakistani strategy is that if they ever get into a nuclear war with India, they need to be able to retreat into Afghanistan as their strategic depth. Well, they can't do that if India's friends rule Kabul and have a true monopoly on force in Afghanistan. And so therefore it's been a vital interest of the Pakistanis to keep the Taliban at play. Obviously they can't overthrow the government and rule the place, but to keep them in business in Afghanistan and to prevent this government that America's created from taking over. And meanwhile, the Americans continue, and this started with Bush and through Clinton and now with Trump too, they continue to ask the Indians to intervene more, to help train troops to, get this, America needs Russian helicopters for our Afghan government, but we've got all these sanctions on Russia for no good reason. But so we ask the Indians, can you do us a favor and buy a bunch of Russian helicopters and give them to the Afghan government for us? And this drives the Pakistanis crazy, right? But we need that help to fight against the Afghan Taliban, right? So our allies, the Indians, we're asking them for help to fight the resistance that's backed by our other allies, our enemies, who are backed by our other allies, the Pakistanis, who are only doing so because we're asking the Indians to help us against them in the first place. And around and around and around. Again, now for 16 years. All right. So now I'll try to be really brief with this because maybe it's less important, but I kind of want to bring up about the rolling of Barack Obama, who ran on expanding the Afghan war, but really only by a couple brigades. And And when he got in there, they just steamrolled this guy. The Pentagon, led by David Petraeus and really Robert Gates, his Republican holdover Secretary of Defense, and they just basically made him, they all threatened to resign if he wouldn't escalate this war. And he did so by 60,000 troops. There were already 30,000. He escalated up to, he gave him another 40. Well, it's spread out through 09. The final surge that everybody talks about is 30,000, but that was on top of another 70 that was already there. Another 40 he'd already sent. Anyway, and then there were another 40,000 NATO troops as well. And they had this whole surge, and this media propaganda campaign, it's reminiscent of the Waco massacre or the case against Saddam Hussein or something, or the case against Russia right now on TV, where it's just this uniformity of opinion and lack of facts, but this narrative that everybody has to back, that the surge worked in Iraq. And never mind what that means. We don't talk about what that means. We just say that it did, and then we move on. And because the surge worked in Iraq, we're going to do it again in Afghanistan. And it was like a fad. It was like Obama's campaign itself, right? It was like this marketing phenomenon. Counterinsurgency. David Petraeus and Stanley McChrystal. These are supermen. They only sleep 4 hours a night, and they only eat 1 meal a day, and they run 10 miles, and they're the most brilliant military commanders that have ever been conceived of. And they know what to do. They can do it. And Barack Obama, Sarah Palin, you might remember, denouncing him for dithering. Why are you dithering? Hurry up and make the decision. You must escalate. And he gave in and did it, and accomplished absolutely nothing for it, except escalating the violence against Afghans of all descriptions. In their test case for counterinsurgency, they said they were going to go to Kandahar City, and they were going to pacify Kandahar City. But their test case first was this tiny little agricultural district called Marja in the Helmand province. And they went to Marja, which they billed as a city of 80,000 people, which in fact was this tiny little town of maybe 5,000 or 7,000 or something, and most of them fled before the Americans came. And with a ratio at one point of literally 2 Marines to every resident, they could not pacify the population there. The Taliban, a lot of the times, they would just go to their job in the daytime, leave the rifle at home, and then fight at night. They didn't even necessarily retreat to neighboring provinces. Stanley McChrystal himself admitted in a moment of candor that, Marja is just a bleeding ulcer. It's just not working. It accomplished nothing. And the strategy supposedly is that we're going to send in our infantry first of all, we're going to do night raids and drone strikes and surgical strikes against all the leaders of the bad guys. But then in the daytime, our regular infantry are going to stand around and basically be traffic cops and officer friendly and the local security force. And then the people of Marja and therefore greater Afghanistan will end up loving our soldiers as their local security force more than they love their own husbands and brothers and fathers who are fighting in the insurgency against us. Because as the Americans tell themselves, the enemy isn't their fathers and brothers and husbands. The enemy is the Taliban, this group of terrorists who came from I don't know where exactly, but not around here, right? And then, so they tell themselves and they build a policy around literally invading and protecting the people who they're invading from their own people who are trying to protect them from us. And then you're supposed to be surprised that it didn't quite work out the way you would have thought. And so it went nowhere, but then Stanley McChrystal, you might remember, he got fired because he badmouthed Obama to the late, great Michael Hastings, the great investigative reporter Michael Hastings, and he got canned. And the coin guys might have gotten away with saying, well, it's not our fault because our great leader got canned. But Obama did a smart thing, one smart thing. He demoted Petraeus, and he made Petraeus, the godfather of coin, go and implement this stuff himself if he's so smart. And so what did Petraeus do? He abandoned counterinsurgency immediately and said, forget it. The escalation is simply an escalation of violence. We're going to do more airstrikes, more night raids, more drone strikes, and we're just going to see what we can do, run out the clock. And then, of course, he luckily was able to run off and be the head of the CIA and not have to see the final drawdown and the failure of his mission there when he clearly had accomplished absolutely nothing. All right, so now the safe haven myth, and I wrote an article about this for the American Conservative if you don't want to read a whole book. this is basically the bottom line talking point that all pro-war mongers say about Afghanistan, and that is that we can't leave or it'll become a safe haven for terrorists like it was before September 11th. So in essence, we have to stay forever to prevent that from ever happening. And the thing of it is that, again, the Taliban always hated al-Qaeda anyway. They were stuck with those guys before. They're not stuck with them now. There haven't been al-Qaeda in Afghanistan this whole time. They fled in 2001. And you can hear a lot of claims, but you will never hear specifics. At one point, Leon Panetta, when he was the head of the, I forget if it was when he was at DOD or CIA, said that, well, I think it's probably less than 100 men. In other words, he couldn't prove to you there was a single Arab fighter in all of Afghanistan anywhere. But, you know, that's what we're going with, shrug. Now, the idea here all along was that al-Qaeda could come back from Pakistan, and then from there it's the magic portal to Boston Logan Airport, where, never mind how Muhammad Atta, the Egyptian studying in Germany, got his passport. But anyway, that al-Qaeda, they could come back. Well, in fact, Obama's drone war in Pakistan in his first term really was very effective at killing the last of the Arab Afghan, really friends of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. There's virtually, and there were only 80 escaped in the first place. And many of them were arrested and turned over by the Pakistani government as well. But of the few who were left, Obama basically finished killing them. But what he did in that same drone war, though, was as a payoff to the Pakistani government, he helped them wage a war against their enemies, the Pakistani Taliban, the Tehrik-i Taliban, which is a totally different faction. And so Obama backed that war and the Pakistani army's assaults against them. Well, some of the refugees from Pakistan's war who fled to Afghanistan for safe haven later declared themselves ISIS. So now, never mind mythical al-Qaeda guys coming back who don't exist and couldn't hurt us if they did anyway. Now it's ISIS. And so even though we're talking about, again, still local Pashtun tribesmen fighting because get the hell off of my lawn, or at least close enough in the area, instead they're portrayed as international Arab terrorists who would attack your ball game and your movie theater and your everything else. And so now this, and I don't know how we're ever going to get over that talking point, because this group does claim loyalty to the Islamic State, not that it exists anymore. But so as far as war propaganda, that's almost foolproof for keeping us there, unless we will insist that no, actually they're really just local Pashtun insurgents, and no problem, and not really Arab terrorists, anti-American terrorists whatsoever. All right, now the Taliban basically rules about half the country. They rule, they say like 40% in the daytime and 60% at night, something like that. They call themselves the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They're not really even a shadow government. They are the government in a huge part of the country. And even David Petraeus himself said that their criminal and civil judicial systems and processes are far more fair and reasonable to the local people, and compared to the government that we have tried to create for them with all of our supposed Western standards and whatever. And so even Petraeus himself says they have every reason to prefer the Taliban as their security force to anything that we have made available, which is all just a bunch of rapists and heroin dealers and scum. And so, the Taliban, they were authoritarian when they were in power, but they brought law and order, which compared to widespread simple criminality and warlordism, certainly the people there have made the choice before that that's what they prefer, and they are clearly making it here. All right, now, so after September 11th, there's a Wall Street Journal reporter named Alan Cullison, and he bought a computer from a kid who basically, ransacked it when the Taliban fled, and this kid went and raided their office, and he sold this computer to this Wall Street Journal reporter, 2 computers actually. And he got the information from one of them, but then he gave both computers over to the military before he got the information off the other. But what he got was a treasure trove of basically email correspondence and different plans and different things, but a lot of email correspondence between al-Qaeda members about what they were about and all kinds of things. And one thing in there was a letter that bin Laden had written to Mullah Omar after September 11th. Saying basically, kissing his ass and saying, I'm really kind of sorry for getting you into this mess. I know this isn't what you wanted, but you're being brave and you're saying the right thing and, taking his side like that. And he says, don't worry. In 10 years, you'll see that I'm right. That this strategy of bogging down the Americans and bankrupting them here will serve our purpose in the long run. Now this is, and he says specifically, explicitly, to recreate what we did to the Russians. It's important to point out, if that's really what he expected from us, was the war that the Russians brought, the Russians killed 1 million people in their Afghan war. Now our government's certainly gotten at least 100,000, maybe a couple more than that killed. But the Soviets killed 1 million people. So for bin Laden, that was his plan. Like, well, we'll get 1 million people killed, sure. But at the end of the day, it'll be worth it. That was his mindset. And that was what he explained to Mullah Omar. That was his plan. Again, to bog us down and bleed us to bankruptcy so that when we finally will have no choice but to withdraw not just from Afghanistan, but from our entire domination of the region there. It's working. Our forces are worn out. They've been at war for 16, 17 years now. Our national debt is $21 trillion. Regimes have been destabilized. Populations have been radicalized. American allies have switched. Chaos has spread all across the Middle East. And they even got their Islamo-fascist caliphate that was nothing but bin Laden's wildest dream and George Bush's most bogus war propaganda back in the early part of this century. And they even got their Islamic State in western Iraq and eastern Syria for 3 years there. All as a result of America taking the bait, taking advantage. It's not that George Bush was a fool, sorta. It's mostly that bin Laden knew he would cynically take advantage. And that was what he was counting on. And so, Bush did what he did deliberately. It's not just that he's a sucker. What he did was wrong, and he knew it was wrong. He was getting away with murder, but he also bungled it. And he also did exactly what it was that the enemy was expecting and trying to provoke him to do. Okay, so now you go back to the safe haven myth here and what they always tell us about, well, we still got to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here. Except that Nidal Hasan, that did the Fort Hood attack, said that he was motivated by the war in Afghanistan, which the men he killed were about to deploy to, in fact. Then there was the Tsarnaev brothers that bombed the Boston Marathon. Omar Mateen, who was responsible for the slaughter at the nightclub in Orlando, Florida. Najibullah Zazi, who luckily was caught by the FBI in what was not a fake entrapment plot by the FBI, but a legit one. There are some legit ones. And they caught him, but he was going to blow up New York subway system. Faisal Shahzad, who failed, thank goodness, to blow up Times Square in 2010, which was full of women and children at the time. Ahmed Rahami, who did the New Jersey and New York sidewalk bombings that luckily didn't kill anyone. I think that was just last year or the year before that. And then just last June, there was an attack at an airport in Michigan by a Canadian who grabbed a knife and tried to kill a cop and take his gun. But luckily, the janitor saved the day, actually, and wrestled him down. And all of these men have cited America's war and violence in Afghanistan as part of their motivation to attack us here in the United States. And Thomas Gibbons Neff, who is a Marine and an Afghan war vet who writes for the Washington Post, said, I forget about which one it was, I think it was after Nidal Hasan. He said, everything I did in Afghanistan, I told myself, I'm doing this to keep these people away from my people. Better they come and fight me. I put myself in danger so that they don't hurt my people back home. That's what I'm doing here. But if what I'm doing in Afghanistan is motivating attacks back home, then what I'm doing is the wrong thing. What am I doing? Especially when it's clear that's not working and it can't work. Work to achieve America's goals there. And I call that backdraft, because it's not really the long-term consequences of secret foreign policies, right? It's immediate consequences of obvious policies that blow up right in your face. Like all the chaos going on in Syria right now, backdraft. And then there's the consequences for us here. You know, bin Laden really did want you to lose your freedom, but not because he hated it. It's because he hated you. And he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the choking life. You are going to suffer under authoritarianism as your government clamps down in their security response to our terrorist attacks. And he knew that we were so jealous of our freedom that we would resent it. He hoped we would, I guess. I don't know if maybe some of us don't. But he hoped that we cared enough about our freedom that we would argue that, look, if we have to give up our freedom as the cost of dominating the Middle East, then we don't want to pay that price. If that's the price of being innocent and free and democratic and white and Christian and whatever, I guess, how can you back down? But if all we have to do is stop dominating the Middle East when, hey guys, we're the middle part of North America, well then we might prefer our Bill of Rights to that. And that was part of it. And as you guys are well aware and have seen like the worst, slowest motion train wreck going on in front of your eyes, we have lost rights after liberty in this century. The Bill of Rights is virtually a complete dead letter now. You know, in 1999, Bill Clinton's government came out with the Know Your Customer regulations, where your bank was supposed to rat on you for everything. And the right wing freaked out, led by the Wall Street Journal. And a bunch of right-wing Republicans in Congress, Lott and Gingrich and the rest of them, stopped it. Or I guess Gingrich was gone by then. But anyway, Hastert, the rapist. And they stopped it. But, you know, that's just like one small subsection of the Patriot Act. That's nothing, right? Know Your Customer regulations is your bank is telling them everything about you all day, every day. And they don't even need that, right? We have the Snowden documents now. We know how far they've gone in monitoring us. They have a record of everywhere your cell phone has been for the last 5 years. Every car you've ridden in, every living room you sat in, every association, no matter how tenuous, you've had. And this is how they pick people to kill with drones in Afghanistan, by the way. You sat at the table with you, and you were in a room with him, and now you guys are linked. You're a nexus, and you're on the hit list. And this is how they're treating all of us now, as a long-term result of this war. And when you try to push back against it, when certain congressmen or senators ever try to push back against it, all we get is the old refrain, don't you know there's a war on? Don't you know there's enemies out there? As long as we're fighting, we can never undo this. There ought to be a real big motive for us to stop doing it when we're not supposed to be doing it in the first place. And now I'll just say real quick that Donald Trump knew that he shouldn't do this. And he opposed the war on Twitter for about 5 years. He would criticize the war. Now, he could have criticized Obama for not escalating enough, right? A lot of Republicans criticized him for not escalating and winning the war, that wimp. But Donald Trump said, this is stupid. We're wasting our money. These people hate us. The soldiers we're training shoot our men in the back for training them. Get out of Afghanistan, make America great again. And that was part of his campaign against Obama that he launched years before he launched his official campaign in 2015. And in fact, I think he really talked himself into it.
And turn right on Riders Lane.
No, you got to make a U-turn.
You can see I'm not even touching
The government's heard enough.
That's right. Yeah, I said the keyword Snowden, and they started tapping in. All right.
no more right or left turn.
There you go. Plumb line, straight ahead. All right. Oh yeah, so no, at one point when Obama said, okay, you had your surge, but now we're going to draw the troops down, the military tried to buck and tried to say, no, we think we need to stay, we need to keep at least this many, and they tried to tell John McCain, and Obama just shut them down and refused to go along with that. To his credit, at least, he finally stuck with drawing them down, not all the way like he promised, but most of the way down, certainly compared to the height of the surge. And at that time, Donald Trump tweeted that he took Obama's side. I forgot exactly how he said it, but he said basically these generals should shut up and do what the commander-in-chief says. He's right. It's time to end this war. And Trump obviously hated Obama for years. So he really had talked himself into this position on Afghanistan, which is easy enough because he's right, obviously. And so when it came down to it, he even took Obama's side over the generals when it came to getting out of there. He absolutely knew better. And last year, he fought with McMaster and he kicked the can down the road over and over again. And he didn't finally even authorize his new escalation until August, which really proves only that he knows better, which makes him that much more guilty for escalating anyway. And it's in the book Fire and Fury, the quote from the Deputy National Security Advisor, Dina Powell, who said, look, if Trump pulls the troops out of Afghanistan, then he's lost the war. And Trump can't lose a war. And so just like LBJ saying, I know I can't win, but I'll be damned if I'm going to be the first president to lose a war and it's going to hurt me. And then he didn't even run for re-election anyway. But anyway, Just like that, and just like Barack Obama didn't want to have to tangle with Lindsey Graham and John McCain all day, every day for 8 years over Afghanistan, Trump gave in for political reasons, for his own selfish best interest, at the expense of the people of Afghanistan, at the expense of the American people. And the thing is Dina Powell is wrong, right? Because it makes sense that if Trump pulled the troops out, then anything bad that happens in Afghanistan after that, people are going to say, oh, it's all Trump's fault for pulling the troops out, right? But he's Donald Trump. So he's not even a governor, much less a senator. He didn't vote for this stuff. He's a winger enough that he can frame it however he wants. And the framing is obvious. That stupid idiot George Bush got us into this mess. And that weak loser Barack Obama completely botched it. And so now it's their problem. The government in Kabul, not my problem. Local Pashtun tribesmen who want RGIs off their lawn, deal. You're not our enemy, you never really were, and now you're not again, and that's it. The cost of tying up these loose ends, not that the American military and intelligence services know how to tie up any of these loose ends to create any kind of reasonable soft landing, but even presuming the possibility, not for a price we're willing to pay. Not any longer. That's it. That's all he had to say. And the American people would have been with him. The American people have been over the Afghan war since 2012. Since probably before that, but at least since 2012, majorities have said that we shouldn't even have fought it. You know, he's a Republican, so you got the whole left would certainly not criticize him for leaving Afghanistan, or very little. And the right, they're over it too. The right, their sons have died in this thing, have been maimed in this thing, and have achieved nothing in this thing, and it's undeniable at this point, and they know that. And when Donald Trump denounced George Bush and denounced the Iraq War in South Carolina, he won 2/3 of the vote the next day. The other 17 candidates shared the other third. And that's the most militarized state in the Union. And those guys had fought in it. And Jeb brought George out to run and campaign with him. And he got nothing. So Donald Trump really blew it, and he absolutely did not have to give in to the typical Hillary Clintonite thinking on politics right there. He absolutely could have just said enough is enough. It's everybody else's fault but mine. And in fact, he could do that right now because he just fired H.R. McMaster, who was behind pushing for this surge. And so, you know, never mind Bolton, I don't have another hour. But he just got rid of McMaster, and this was McMaster's war. He was the one who pushed this and pushed this and pushed this. Donald Trump could right now say, well, McMaster had a year and he didn't do it. And so pull the plug. He could do that right now, and he should. And then I won't go on and belabor the point, but I will say real quickly that libertarians, virtually all of libertarianism, inside the party and inside the movement and everywhere, we're good on war. And there have been a lot of real heroes on anti-war stuff in the libertarian movement. But the National Libertarian Party has really done a horrible job of opposing war in the 21st century. And, you know, I understand that this stuff is complicated, and I set a bad example, right? That you got to read 1 million books to know enough to be against this stuff and this kind of thing. It really shouldn't be that hard. But, you know, libertarians and Libertarian Party guys, even the Libertarian Party guys who've been weak on this, they're actually good on war themselves, right? They just don't understand that the Libertarian Party, the Libertarian movement especially, and the Libertarian Party have a unique opportunity. It's our comparative advantage that we stay anti-war when liberals are in power. We're not a bunch of hypocrites who didn't say nothing when Barack Obama was at war, which is, of course, what any right-winger would say to any left-winger right now, saying what I say, right? And we're not burdened with that. We're all good on this stuff. And if we prioritize libertarianism as the party of the anti-war movement, then that's good for us. Public choice theory, right? What's good for the leaders of the Libertarian Party? What's good for the Libertarian Party? What's good for the movement and for the country and for the world is to abolish the American empire. Full stop. You cannot have freedom in an authoritarian state. You cannot have, get rid of the IRS when you're occupying Afghanistan. You cannot be a republic and an empire. We have to choose. And you look at every other thing that libertarians prioritize. I mean, other than, maybe on education and gay marriage, and there's some things, drug wars and stuff, I guess, it's true. But on many of our most important issues, especially on financial issues, and when it comes down to our 4th and 5th and 6th Amendment rights and this kind of most crucial stuff, that we cannot make progress on those things. We cannot repeal the Patriot Act and end NSA spying and all of these things while we're at war. And so we have to find a way as a movement and as a party to really prioritize that and let the American people know who are the libertarians. They're the guys who are always anti-war, who we can count on to be anti-war and to lead anti-war efforts. And so I would just, put that to you as a challenge to take up. And people say that they agree with me about that sometimes, but I really want to see that in action on the National Libertarian Party level. So thank you all very much for having me here. But yeah, I'm happy to take questions too. Sir.
Do you think in 15 years we'll be talking about getting out of North Korea?
Oh man. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and say something optimistic here. I think there's a huge opportunity, and I don't know how likely it is that it'll really be taken advantage of. There's a huge opportunity for Donald Trump to make peace with North Korea here. And just like I'm saying about the Libertarian Party, it's and about his bad decision about Afghanistan, it's in his personal political interest to do this. He's got a real crisis where everyone in government has drawn this red line. North Korea can't have nukes and missiles. Well, they got both. So now what? We're going to have a horrible war that'll kill at least 1 million people as a baseline to start the first week. We're going to figure out something else to do here. And the obvious example is Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger went to China and they shook hands with Mao Zedong and they just said, forget this, let's not have a war, let's work things out. So they still had a lot of issues outstanding, Taiwan for one, and many others. But they said, let's break the ice and then let's work things out. And that's what Donald Trump has an opportunity to do with Kim right here. And I hope that there's a lesson for him in doing it and he succeeds, that, you know what, he could go to Tehran and he could go to Beijing and he could go to Moscow and he could just make peace and say, how do you like me now, Democrats? What are they going to do? They're going to really just attack him from the right on national security for the rest of the next 4 years and watch him get reelected in their face over making peace, which he absolutely could do. If Barack Obama went to Iran, they'd hang him from a tree. They would have just absolutely crucified him. But Donald Trump, he's got Fox News behind him. He's got General Mattis on his right flank to protect himself from any criticism that, I mean, look, nobody ever called Trump a weak wimp or anything like that. There's a lot of accusations against him, but total pushover or weakling or that kind of thing never applied to him. So he could go over there and say, look, I'm making peace because I'm smart, not because I'm a pushover, but because this is the right thing to do. He could do it in Afghanistan, he could do it in Iraq and Syria and the rest. We have no reason to have a permanent conflict with North Korea or with Iran or any of these countries at all. So I'm not saying I think he'll do that. That was, my Ron Paul speech was, this guy will do that. But the Trump speech is just that he could, if he could see, if he had the vision to recognize his place in history and how he could fit there. Sir?
How can we reshape the libertarian message on foreign policy so it sounds more universal? Because when we say, we have to get out of Afghanistan, we have to stay away from North Korea, but we never mention our membership in NATO. It sounds a lot like someone saying, well, there are these countries where people look like us and kind of talk like us where we belong, and we should just avoid all those foreigners.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. And I don't know if it was ever in the Libertarian platform. I think it used to actually be in the Libertarian platform that they wanted out of NATO. And that absolutely, the radical position is clearly the one to take here. My criticism of the National Party really goes back to 2004 when I was an advisor for Michael Badnarik, who was a good guy, but who I just could not get to prioritize this issue. And I remember talking with Judge Jim Gray. And if you guys are familiar with Jim Gray, what's so useful about him is that he's a conservative judge, a former conservative Republican judge who changed on the drug war. Now, if he was a former liberal judge who was always against the drug war, then that wouldn't really be that impressive. But he's attacking the right from the right. He didn't stop being a conservative. He just stopped supporting the drug war. So that's exactly the kind of guy that we need to be leading the anti-war movement. right? Is somebody like him. And I talked to him and he said, oh no, we can't leave now or the violence will get worse, which is of course just the Fox News watered down Republican talking point. And by the way, in the history of Iraq War II, staying after 2004 is what made the violence much, much worse, and taking the side of the Shiites in the civil war that began in 2005. Thank you very much, Judge Gray. But so what he was saying was, you know, we will seem unreasonable if we demand anything but an appropriately managed soft landing and responsible withdrawal from Iraq, which is a total non-answer. When the answer should have been, the Libertarian Party should have been calling for George Bush to be removed from office and prosecuted for war crimes, for torture and murder, and for lying the country into war. And he's lucky we don't burn the house down right now. And if that had been the Libertarian Party position, I'm telling you, would have done everything for the Libertarian Party and the Libertarian movement. That who are these people who, you know, frankly speaking, are mostly all white and Christian and own businesses, or at least are pro-capitalist, who liberals see as to the right of conservatives, right? And yet, how come we're so good on war, leading the charge on war? Just like how great it is that we have Judge Gray to lead the path against the drug war. If this conservative is against the drug war, this conservative judge, it's not because he's a pushover, it's because he's smart. It's because he's figured something out that this isn't right. It's the same reason we needed the LP to be anti-war, to make anti-war their highest priority. And absolutely abolishing NATO, and I'll go ahead and tell you guys, I never will publish it, but I never had a job, but I did talk on the phone with Gary Johnson a few times and send him a hell of a lot of talking points, none of which he ever used. And a huge part of that was urging him to take on, because remember the fake Russia narrative we're all suffering under now began during it was still in the summer of 2016, before the vote when they started this. And I was telling him to take advantage of this in order to explain why America's problem with Russia is all America's fault. It's all because of NATO expansion. And the only thing I can say good about Trump is at least he ain't as bad as Hillary on NATO. And you know, pay them both kind of left-handed compliments as a way to attack the other guy for being even worse on this stuff. And I said he should be leading the charge, and especially on Russia, because that's the issue of the day. And just think, if Hillary Clinton and all these crybabies had spent the last year and a half crying about the Russian agent Gary Johnson instead of Jill Stein. And what if all of that attention was on the libertarians? And then what if the libertarians were like, hell yeah, get along with Russia, abolish nukes, and support peace, and this is all Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama's fault. Abolish NATO. Abolish NATO. And if we took that radical stand, we'd have gotten that attention. It would have been great for, you know, obviously for the overall situation, but good for the LP too. Yes, sir? Oh. Just exercising? Go ahead.
Kind of on that theme of like maybe it'll take someone to the right. I mean, it's almost like, I mean, this is so crazy, this whole policy, and all the mistakes that have been made. Do you think there's even just one honest person who's been an architect of this, who might have a deathbed conversion, maybe he has, God forbid, you know, been diagnosed with cancer and wants to say, you know, I want to do one last thing before, you know, my body departs this earth. I mean, do you see anyone doing something like that?
I'd sure like to. You know, I mean, there's one story in the past I can think of is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the chief of staff to Colin Powell, his right-hand man in the first Bush Jr. term, and had helped to put together the presentation to lie us into war in front of the United Nations. And after that, he had a full turn, you know, mea culpa kind of thing, and has really done a lot of great work ever since then trying to make up for it. But I'll tell you what, I mean, there are a couple of two-star generals, but I would kill an innocent person to have a right-wing three-star general come out against the war and in a hardcore way. You know, the best example of this is Colonel David Hackworth, who, I don't know if y'all are familiar, he ended up dying of bladder cancer from Lyndon Johnson's Agent Blue in Vietnam. But he was the most decorated officer in the Vietnam War. And he was hardcore anti-war right-winger in the lead-up, really in the 1990s and in the lead-up to Iraq War II. And he just really knew what was going on. And his entire bent was he was here to protect the enlisted men from the officers. The officers and the think tankers and all these horrible people people that run the government. They're the government. It was almost like a class war, where the enlisted men, they're not the government, they're the people. And they're the ones being lied to and abused and misused. And let me tell you what's going to happen if we march into Iraq. The Shia this and the Sunni that and all this, and he absolutely knew it. He was great. My favorite anecdote of Colonel Hackworth is, I was a delivery guy at the time, driving around. I was listening to the Sean Hannity show, and this was 2002 Sean Hannity. I mean, the worst Sean Hannity ever. And he was so bad. And he's trying to talk over Hackworth, and at one point Hackworth says, "Shut your mouth and listen, boy." And Sean Hannity goes, "Yes, sir, Colonel, I'm sorry." And then Hackworth goes on to say, "Listen, man, we don't have enough special operations forces to run every errand in the world that you think can be done. This is not the way we do things. And we're sending our guys into a situation. They're going to be fighting in urban combat. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. You're telling me you know better, and I'm telling you you don't." And that is worth a million of me's. Right? But how do we get these guys to, I don't know, risk their pension or their whatever it is to come forward? Veterans for Peace, just in case anyone watches this on YouTube later, part of Veterans for Peace. I wish they'd drop peace and say against the war, and I wish they'd drop the dove. Because what they're saying basically is identify me with anti-Vietnam War hippies and Janis Joplin and like counterculture dude, be cool and whatever, when they're combat veterans, most of them. And they're basically conceding all of their macho away the moment that they organize by saying basically now we're former soldiers, but now we're liberals. Instead of saying we're former soldiers and we're telling you this is wrong, which is 100 million times more powerful of a statement. And this is a huge group that has, chapters all across the United States of America. And a lot of them are liberals, where it's fine. I'm not, whatever, people believe what they want, but I'm just saying in terms of effectiveness, people presume that liberals are anti-war anyway. Never impress anybody with that. But if they were the veterans against the war, then they really attacked the right from the right, and it didn't say what we should spend this money on instead, but just say we should stop wasting it and kind of not even take right-wing positions, but just kind of delete the more left-sounding ones. They could make so much more progress, I think. I mean, and really change things. Phil?
We gotta wrap.
Got to wrap.
Yeah.
Can we do one more?
Sure.
Okay, I'll say it real quick, my answer. Go ahead.
Scott, question for you. Is the driver to our foreign policy now the armaments industry, and was Ambassador Matlock's gaffe to Putin that you've talked about on your show before really the truth of what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? This is always a crazy conspiracy theory until you figure out that actually it was Ike Eisenhower who coined the term, the military-industrial complex. And he was the former 5-star general, supreme allied commander of the United Nations war to liberate Europe from the Nazis. He had more street credibility in American politics than anyone could ever have, and in the American military establishment. And it was everything he could do to tell the Army no, ever. And he said, God help another president that doesn't have the experience I have to keep these men at bay. And he wanted to call it the military-industrial congressional complex. And you could go ahead and add academia and research and high-tech and mass media and everything to the complex. And absolutely, the American empire is a racket. At the bottom line, none of this has to do with defending the national interests and the rights and the liberty of the American people. And everything here has to do with special interests, whether it's Israel or whether it's Lockheed or whether it's admirals and generals who want more stars and decorations for their shirts and want a higher stipend when they retire with more stars and go and sit on the board of Raytheon or General Dynamics. And it's the dirtiest snowball in the world rolling downhill. When Americans talk about, when libertarians especially talk about, we have crony capitalism. The previous speaker was saying, this isn't free market capitalism, this is a setup. We have a quasi-free market, as your government school teacher will call it. Well, the root of all of that is the empire. The root of all of that is the central bank, which is there to make the wars seem free, and all of the rest of what goes along with that. All of the corruption, all of the contracting. Donald Trump just signed a $3.1 trillion budget. They spend $1 trillion solid, $1 trillion a year if you count the VA and if you count the nuclear weapons industry. They spend $1 trillion a year on militarism. It's the biggest honeypot in the history of mankind. You know, it was a scandal when Lockheed spent $14 million lobbying one quarter. I was like, 14 million? That's got to be the best return on an investment anybody has ever made in world history, what Lockheed gets away with pulling out of the American budget. I think they're cutting me off. We could talk after. Okay. Thank you, everyone, very much. Very much.